Ladies and gentlemen,
Court.
Excellencies,
Court.
my name is Tomáš Valášek. I'm Director of Foreign Policy and Defense at the Center for European Reform in London. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second panel of our conference, Russia, Business as Usual. This is really the second time we're discussing Russia at this conference. We had an excellent debate yesterday about Russia in the context of the Georgia war. We went over the usual who did what to whom and when and why. This conversation, the hope is, will be somewhat different. We want to take a more forward-looking approach. The war in Georgia clearly brought home the point that Europe and the United States do need at least a common analysis, if not a common strategy, for Russia. But equally, the war in Georgia brought out some very real differences in the way we view Russia, its intentions, and the hope for a common agreement with it. At the risk of oversimplification, one school of thought within Europe and within the Euro-Atlantic community argues that we do need to take Russia's security interest more seriously into account and possibly reach a new collective security treaty with it. Another school of thought would argue we have listened carefully to Russia, but we found that there is not enough overlap on the basic values and principles, and we should not be reaching a treaty with it which compromises and sells out some of the basic principles and values. To help us navigate these shores and to help us make sense of whether there truly is a room for common agreement with Russia, not just an agreement within Europe, but also a transatlantic agreement, and what does Russia really want? We have assembled a fantastic panel. Congratulations to the organizers. Allow me to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First, His Excellency Māris Riekstiņš, the Foreign Minister of Latvia. Thank you for joining us. Second, Ambassador Kurt Volker, U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO. Third, Mr. Boris Nemtsov, former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, now Chairman of the Union of Oil Exporters. And fourth, last but by no means least, Dr. James Scher, Head of Russia and Eurasia Program at the Chatham House. Mr. Minister, allow me to start with you, if I may. At a meeting in London not too long ago, you listed a set of principles for Europe's engagement with Russia. And the first principle on your list was that Europe must speak with one voice when it speaks to Moscow. Now, if I were Russia, and I imagine if Russia had its own list of principles for speaking with Europe, I assume the number one on its list would be that Europe should not be allowed to speak with one voice to Russia, because Russia finds it in many ways easier to speak directly to Paris or Berlin. How can Latvia entice some of its larger friends within the EU, France, Germany, and others, to agree a common position and to talk to Russia through the EU rather than bilaterally? And if it does so, on what basis, on the basis of what values, what principles would the European Union speak to Russia post-Georgia war?
Well, thank you very much for this question. I think for small countries like Latvia, for countries not possessing huge resources in terms of finances, in terms of military power, or human resources, I see actually only one instrument what we can use in order to achieve our foreign policy objectives, and I think this is to be very much outspoken or to make kind of positive noise. And I believe that for small countries, the only way how we can preserve our interests is to try to contribute to the overall process in the way that all international players are observing international law, they're observing the fundamental principles, and this is why Latvia, but not only Latvia alone, was very much outspoken during those periods when international law was violated, be it in Balkans, be it recently in Caucasus. And I think that we have quite a good examples to demonstrate that this clear position and very outspoken position was as important as someone else's financial or military power. I think many people here in this audience can remember the time when we got an advice from some European leaders to be silent, or that we have missed our opportunity to remain silent. And I think this is a clear indication that the clear positions of every single European nation are important in order to reach a consensus. Actually, I have not heard any advices from anyone that we are too quiet, rather opposite. But this position, this very outspoken position, I think should be based on fundamental principles. This is not just we would like to be in a position to put our veto on important decisions, but that our position is based on international law, on rules of the game, and on previously made international commitments. And I think this principle ought to be applied very much when we speak about our European relations with Russian Federation. I was recently visiting Moscow, and I talked to Minister Lavrov about this, and when it comes to bilateral relations, it seems that we have managed to establish them in a quite pragmatic way. At the same time, we have serious disagreements about the recent crisis in Georgia, and I'm afraid that we will face this situation for many months, possibly years to come. But the message I try to convey being in London, that from our position, the ultimate goal for the European Union and also for NATO alliance, in order to have a successful dialogue with Russian Federation, this is as much unity we can achieve. It's better to have this unity, otherwise, as Minister Lavrov mentioned to me, they do have other possibilities and other frameworks to negotiate with Europeans.
Thank you. Ambassador Volker, one of your jobs in Brussels over the next few months will be to help guide the new administration through a transition and help it frame its policy on Europe. Now imagine, if you will, it's January 2021. The phone in Brussels rings, and it's a new president on the phone, and he's asking you, we have a problem with Russia, we do need to figure out how to speak to it, what to do with it. Help us understand what role Europe can play in our dialogue with Russia. How well is Europe organized to be an effective player vis-à-vis Russia? How much commonality of analysis does Europe and the United States have on Russia? And what role can Europe play in our dialogue as we move on with the new president?
Well, Thomas, I think it's a good question, because I think it is important that the US and Europe do exactly that we do pull together to have truly a unified approach, as part of your question with Maris as well. What I would say is that the transatlantic community is important and unique for one reason, and that's because it is based on human values, freedom, democracy, market economy, rule of law, human rights, and we protect these things in our own societies. And we formed an alliance, we formed NATO to protect our societies against threats from outside and to help build and promote those values in the world. And that's why we've seen this period of NATO enlargement. I think one thing I would have to say in response to that question is that NATO enlargement needs to continue, that this process of building a Europe whole and free is not done. We still have a lot of work to do. And that's a process that's based on standards, of course, because it is additional countries, more countries, living up to these shared values that we hold to become part of our community, but then making that community stronger. And it's a community that builds a better Europe, it builds a better neighborhood, it builds a better neighborhood for Russia as well. It's a community that deals with security challenges, so this is why, for instance, we're in Afghanistan. Our security is affected by what happens there, and we're helping the people of Afghanistan build a society where they're trying to move in the directions of values of democracy in their own society, in their own culture. And in doing this, we need to remain open to Russia. We need to try to work with Russia. We need to be hopeful. We need to believe that the people of Russia also want to see these values realized in their society. We have to be honest that we've had some serious challenges under the current Russian government. We've seen things in the past couple years, essentially reversals in a democratic process, real lack of free media, cracking down on NGOs, significant pressure on any alternative political organizations, centralization of power, the centralization of control of energy supplies and the use of that as a political tool, and pressure on neighbors like Georgia, like Latvia, like Estonia, and we can give lots of examples as to what this is. But the point here is that we can't have a relationship with Russia based on the same values that we had assumed. When we created the NATO-Russia Council in 2002, we made it a partnership among equals. We sat down as 27 countries rather than NATO plus Russia. And we said we wanted to work together in areas where we can and we have common interest in to develop this. Russia never really took advantage of this. And instead, we've seen now challenges coming from Russia, aggressive behavior in the neighborhood and challenges to democracy at home that call into question the premises of that kind of relationship. But we shouldn't conclude from that that there should be no relationship at all, because we should have an ability to communicate with Russia, to explain how we see things, explain our values, how building a stronger democratically based community is also, we believe, fundamentally a good that Russia benefits from as well. And to hold out the prospect of closer cooperation in the future, but only insofar as it's based on these shared values.
Thank you. Could I ask a quick follow-up question to tie this debate into the one we heard just a few minutes ago about NATO enlargement? You made two important points. You said NATO enlargement will continue, but of course it is based on certain values, and we'll need to make sure those values are enforced. Post-Georgia war, will NATO filter the candidate states through a tighter filter perhaps than before the war? Will we be changing the criteria for enlargement? Will Article 5 issues, the ability of alliance to live up to its defense commitments, be more important? And if so, what does it mean for Georgia?
Right. I think the answer to your question can be summed up by saying some things still make sense. So, for example, the idea that NATO enlargement should be based on countries meeting good standards of democracy, reform, and so forth, that still makes sense. Another thing that makes sense is that NATO shouldn't fold its arms and wait. NATO should try to help countries, and the Membership Action Plan was created at the 1999 Washington Summit with that in mind, that how do we help countries develop through their reform process? And we need to continue that effort to help countries through their own reforms so that they can present a stronger candidacy. Another thing that doesn't change is that throughout the process of NATO enlargement, we did have a relationship with Russia, and we communicated with Russia about what this means, what it doesn't mean. NATO being a defensive alliance doesn't pose a threat to anyone. The realization of these transatlantic values in societies doesn't hurt anyone, but is in fact good for Europe, good for the countries concerned, good for all of us. Those things don't change, and that will be the continuing process here. I know the next follow-up is on Membership Action Plan, so I may as well answer it. We think the Membership Action Plan is a tool to help countries, and therefore it ought to be used. We created it for that reason. It didn't carry any special political significance. The decision on inviting a country to join NATO came later, when NATO was ready and the judgment was that country was ready. So the process getting there was one using the Membership Action Plan. Since we created the Membership Action Plan, it has become more politicized in the way MAP is viewed. And I think that's become an obstacle to our purposes in some ways, that it's become so politicized that we're not able to move ahead in the way that I think there is a way in which we all still agree that NATO enlargement should continue, and we should be helping countries reform. And I think getting over that politicization of the MAP in some way is a challenge for the foreign ministers when we meet in December.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. Nemtsov, help us understand today's Russia, its values and its principles. I went very briefly in my opening remarks over the sort of two schools of thoughts within Europe on how much common ground there is with Russia. What would be your advice to those in Europe, whether that's the first camp, those that is believing there is enough common ground, or those skeptics who believe there really isn't? Which school of thought do you think is closer to capturing the heart and mind of today's Russia? What potential is there for an agreement on perhaps a new collective security agreement with Russia? And if so, on what principles would it be based? Would it, for instance, enshrine a role for the European Union and the United States? Would it allow the countries in our common neighborhood, like Ukraine, to pursue a truly independent foreign policy?
First of all, fortunately, I do not represent Kremlin. I represent Russian democratic opposition. We are under preparation for the Congress for Opposition, which working name is Solidarity. A lot of Polish are very proud that we want to use such kind of name. I explain you why. First of all, this is very clear and very warm word for Russian people. Second, this organization won not in Russia but in Poland, but I hope that we will repeat this success in my country. Of course, to understand foreign policy of Kremlin and economic policy, international policy, means to understand what's happened in domestic level. And I can describe a system like Putinism, and Putinism means monopoly. Monopoly in ideology. Ideology is an ideology of a nostalgia about superpower, about empire. Monopoly in economy. Gazprom is a well-known example. Monopoly in politics. Look at the governors, Russian governors, or look at the so-called Russian parliament. Two-thirds of the parliament belong to the Putin's party, the United Russia. And monopoly, as everybody knows, means corruption. No competition, no transparency, nothing. This is corruption. According to Transparency International, Russia now is in the 147th place among very poor African countries. And this is very sad, very pity story. And this is very important to understand. If you are a leader of corrupted power, the only way to explain why everything is corrupted is to have enemies around. If you have enemies around, don't ask me a question why you steal Gazprom. You know, a few weeks ago, we published a report, which is well known among this conference. Ambassador, do you know this report? Putin and Gazprom.
Yes.
Putin and Gazprom. We describe, using official statistics, what's happened inside the biggest gas company in the world. And we mentioned that about $60 billion of property, including one of the biggest Russian Gazprom bank, insurance companies like savās, the biggest pension fund, Gas Fund, were stolen during Putin presidency and Putin management inside Gazprom. And we describe a lot of situation concerning gas supply into Ukraine, so-called Rosokorenergo, etc. Nothing. Response was nothing. But on the other hand, if you switch on TV, immediately you explain that crisis in Russia based on American, and Americans specially organized crisis in Russia to reduce level of strength of Russia and level of influence of Russian Federation. This is propagandistic machine. And monopoly, I mentioned in politics and economy, ideology, the most important point for Putinism is monopoly on TV. You can organize an experiment for yourself. Watch Russian TV for 2 weeks and don't read Western newspapers at all. Watch just few weeks. And after that, I will talk with you. I'm afraid that you will say me that America is a devil empire, that Georgian government is a fascist, and even Lukashenko is not a very good guy because he doesn't want to recognize Ossetia and Abkhazia, you know? Imagine that 142 million of Russian people watch TV not for 2 weeks, but for 9 years. Every day, people listen to these terrible stories about America, about Western, about Baltics, about superpower Estonia, superpower Georgia, etc., right? And of course, this propaganda is very important. My estimation is that Putin policy failed. We have no friends, not only around, but even in the world. Who are our friends? Look at the recognition decision. Who supported? Hamas, our great friend, Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua, the great friend, and stupid Hugo Chavez, right? He even didn't recognize, he said that he understands why. But nobody, including Kazakhstan leader, Armenian leader, Lukashenko, I don't mention, of course, Ukraine, etc., nobody, and China, even China, they do not support that. That's why this is very important. His policy lead to a lot of enemies around. It's easy to get bribes, it's easy to be corrupted, but it's impossible to survive during the crisis. Next point, crisis. Propaganda said that Russian capital market fall down 75% have fallen down from the May days because of America. But if you look more careful to the situation, you immediately understand the Dow Jones fall down dramatically, but not like in Russia. And capital flight from Russia was huge. Last week, capital flight was $30 billion, just for 1 week. And central bank reserves reduced, and now it's level less than $500 billion. This is important. I believe that if crisis will be continued and corrupted government will be continued to distribute money and they are ready to pay about a little bit less than $200 billion, I believe that foreign policy will be not so tough. It will be more softer. Because Putinism based on oil prices and Putinism based on unlimited amount of budget money and unlimited amount of reserves. Now Russia faced real economic, a real financial problem. What I mean, not only capital market, but what's happened with Russian ruble, what's happened with Russian corporate debt, and Putin is ready to support private business because he's afraid that, for example, Norilsk nickel will be in the hand of Royal Bank of Scotland, etc. And I think that step by step they will be involved mainly on domestic situation because unemployment, because of reduction of economic performance, etc. They will face and they will understand that. Mr. Kudrin, who is the Minister of Finance, said that if oil prices will be less than $70, 70, which is huge amount, well, Russian budget will be deficit. Price for Russian oil is about 60, and of course they have a lot of reserves, but I believe that if such kind of corrupted system will be continued, they will face a lot of financial problems. Now Putin insisted to increase military budget. He increased military budget 20%, and he proclaimed this idea for the next year. Military budget will be about $50 billion next year. But I think that they, step by step, will think about what should be done with bankrupt pension fund, what should be done with social securities, etc. My general view is that Putinism, which was founded and based on big, huge oil prices, will be over, and situation will change. The biggest role in that will play Russian opposition, mainly liberal democratic opposition. Unfortunately, liberal democratic opposition is splitted and very weak. And my main task, my main goal is to do everything to be united and to organize real influential political force. The only way, believe me, the only way to improve relationship with Russia is democratization of Russia. The only way. Of course, we can talk about Afghanistan, you are right. Even we can talk about Iran. We can talk about pipeline system, which is, from my point of view, completely fraud, especially Nord Stream. I explain you why. Because there is no gas. There is no gas. You know, you can build, no problem, but you need permission from Estonia, first of all. But even you will get it, which is fantasy. There is no gas. Well, read this bestseller. Well, yeah. And but I believe that the only democratization will help to improve our relationship. That's why our task, like Russian politicians, is to forget about you know, your own ego and to think about Russian future. As far as Europe is concerned, I agree with the minister that Europe has no common policy. Europe has the president. Because, you blocked constitution and you decided to be independent. I don't know what you decided, but finally you have your common policy, and Putin understands that very carefully. He has special relationship with Berlusconi. He has relationship with Sarkozy, even with Angela Merkel, with everybody, and with all Europe, which is important. And he believes that gas, oil, capitals, whatever, some investment to Russia is very important to understand why you don't have to be united with, for example, New Europe. And I think that common policy is absolutely key point, very, very important. Second, I think that, for example, when Medvedev said that we need the united security, that we need new alliance, that's right, that's a great idea. But let's start from our values. If we do not have common values, how to build security? Because, for example, for Latvia to be a member of NATO is a security. For Putin, this is a great danger, right? That's why how to build common security if you have no common values. That's why I think that to explain them that, guys, okay, we are ready to talk about common security, but let's first of all to discuss about fundamental points. I think that this is very important.
Thank you for the sobering thoughts. Dr. Scher, we have just heard Europe has no president and because of that perhaps no credibility. Can you help us sort of understand the institutional elements of all this? There was a time where we thought we had the institutional part of the Russian relationship figured out. The Permanent Joint Council first, when that didn't quite work, then the NATO-Russia Council, and yet the relation seems to have fallen apart. Is there an institutional answer to this? Is there a way of improving the relationship by finding the right framework? And if I may really quickly, to make it a little more complicated, is there a new institutional framework we need for the common neighborhood as well? When one looks at the Bucharest decision and map, to my eyes, we managed to say yes and no to Georgia's aspirations at the same time. I'm not sure how that has helped add clarity to the issue. Since then, the positions have only hardened. Is there an institutional fix we need for the common neighborhood as well?
Chairman, in the first place, I have to say with pride as well as shame, I'm Mr. Scher, not Dr. Scher. And secondly, if you allow me, I just must begin with a word about Russia itself, because that's our defining subject here. What has happened in Georgia should provide conclusive proof to all of Europe that Russia defines its core interests at the expense of many of its key neighbors. The right of Russia's neighbors to develop according to models of their own choosing with partners of their own choice, even in the 1990s, was not accepted in principle, but then it was conceded in practice. Now that Russia has reacquired usable power, it is no longer being conceded. Dmitry Medvedev to Valdai was very explicit on this point. Russia is no longer weak and feeble. We will no longer tolerate your presence here. We will not tolerate it anymore, quote unquote. The second point, and I pick up from what Boris has said, more worrying than the policy of Russia is the mood of Russia. This mood is a dangerous combination of a sense of abida, injury, and a sense of pride at the recovery of strength. And this in a country with a political culture that has, by Western standards, an unhealthy obsession and fascination with the question of power. And Medvedev has to operate in this mood, and therefore he is under political and psychological pressure to be tougher than anybody else. So we are dealing with a country which is both bully and victim. This is very difficult. And it's a country that is predisposed to anticipate that we will disapprove of what it does, and predisposed to conclude that nothing will come of our disapproval. Business as usual is our other subject, and now I'm getting closer to the specific question you asked me. Business as usual between the West and Russia was not successful. Now, in the Black Sea region, which I think is a very important region of NATO interest, NATO has long been departing from the tenets of realism. NATO has been effective when it has been built on a combination of common interests, shared values, and collective capacity. Since the events of 9/11, we have allowed a gap to develop between our commitments and our capacity, particularly in this region. And in Georgia, we set up a bluff that was waiting to be called, and it was called. We also assumed that our entire post-Cold War, postmodern consciousness about building common security would be contagious and that Russia would eventually absorb it. We can now see this is not true. The EU also needs to re-examine its premises. The premise has been that as Russia experiences economic growth, prosperity, self-confidence, as there is more trade, more investment, all of Russia's post-imperial syndrome will recede, and these issues will no longer be important. Well, all the first set of things has happened, and we see what the result now is. So now I come to the question you put, which is where do we go from here? The first thing we have to understand, it's very difficult for us. We are weak in this region. The West is weak. We are in a position of weakness. Russia has cards, and they know it. We are in a region where bluffs will be called. So what errors must we avoid? There are two. First, by all means, we must avoid doing anything which concedes by principle or by default, wittingly or unwittingly, the creation, the legitimization of spheres of influence in this part of the world. I am astonished that those people who advocate returning to these principles have such a poor historical memory of how infirm those arrangements were, how infirm and how volatile. The pre-1914 arrangements led to 1914, not accidentally, inevitably. The second point, and it's my last point, is that we must also protect ourselves and not be tempted to enlarge NATO from a position of weakness. Our challenge is to strengthen the security and self-confidence of Russia's neighbors. And that is an enterprise which requires very concrete, very methodical, professional steps. It means assistance to countries' intelligence structures, security structures, and armed forces. It requires on our part an expansion of intellectual, political, and financial resources. Until we do that, MAP will be a distraction. And if we refuse to do that, then MAP will have no value. The time for Ukraine and Georgia to enter NATO is the time when their membership of NATO strengthens their own security and that of NATO. That is not where we are today. We need jointly, and partners in the region must play as great a role as we play in jointly creating those conditions. Thank you.
Thank you. This panel is supposed to be an interactive experience, and I would like to open the conversation in a minute to the audience for questions, but I also wanted to abuse my ready access to the microphone and ask a follow-up question of the Mr. Foreign Minister, if I may. We have just heard an eloquent call for Europe to not necessarily deny, those would not be your words, but certainly not concede spheres of influence in Europe. Is there a risk that as we get into the game of spheres of influence, that we compromise on some of our values? Belarus is the one example I have in mind. The European Union has recently begun revisiting its policy on Belarus. The unspoken quid pro quo was that we expect Belarus to do good on elections. It hasn't. None of the opposition representatives made it into the government. Nevertheless, the European Union went ahead and for all intents and purposes, did away with the blacklist for those who are not allowed to travel to European Union. We now hear that President Lukashenko may well visit the EU soon. Are we finding the right balance between our values within the European Union and the need to step up our involvement in the eastern neighborhood? Are we not at the risk of actually compromising and undermining some of the things that we stand for after the Georgia war?
Well, first of all, on spheres of influence, I think the ultimate goal for EU and also for NATO ought to be accommodate those wishes of the nations surrounding Russia or surrounding European Union by engaging them in a very productive dialogue, by responding to their wishes to become members of our two organizations. In this context, while Latvia has supported always the map for Georgia and Ukraine, we also do understand that map is not a guarantee for membership. Of course not. But this is a very good tool for motivation for those respective nations, what they have to do in terms of reforming their societies, reforming their military forces. We do know that from our own experience. And I think sometimes this symbolic role of map is overplayed in a sense. I think those two countries have received in Bucharest the language, but we here in Baltic states have never received. We stated in Bucharest that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. Never ever the Baltic states received such a language at any of NATO meetings or gatherings. I think map we have to consider as an important, practical instrument for motivating the nations, for revisiting their progress, and then at the end of the day, we, the members of NATO, we will make our decision whether they are qualified for membership. Maybe it will take 5, 7, 10, or 15 years. But to say that they are not in a position to enter this exercise, I think this is a mistake. Question about values, and you mentioned the Belarus case. I think we have to consider the latest decisions by European Union regarding reopening of certain dialogue with Belarus in a context of what has been done in Belarus in previous months. For instance, openness to the international observers during their elections. And if we look at those elections in Belarus, of course, there are a number of shortcomings. There is no question about it. But in terms of inviting international observers, that they are able to participate in observing the elections and able to present a report on those shortcomings, I think this is a progress which ought to be recognized. Let's be honest, in some of the OSCE member states, the OSCE observers were not able to participate in election observance process. The same happened in Russia. Presidential elections, parliamentary elections, the OSCE observers or ODIHR observers were not able to go there and participate. And I think that in talking to all those countries around the Russian Federation and also in talking to the Russian officials, we have to avoid that we apply double standards. If the European Union and NATO is ready to negotiate with Russian Federation under the given circumstances, then it's pretty hard for me to imagine why we are not ready to negotiate with Belarus or with the countries in Central Asia, where also, as we all know, number of them perhaps cannot be regarded as the beacons of democracy. So let's avoid the double standards, but let's stick on the principles. And here I agree with Boris Nemtsov that the principles and value are important. And I think this will be one of the biggest challenges for us among the European Union members when we will discuss the report prepared by the European Commission regarding the whole range of bilateral cooperation between European Union and Russian Federation. And when we will revisit the question concerning the reopening of PCA negotiations. And we know what the commitments were made previously in September at the level of European Council meeting. And I expect to have very, very, well, diplomatically saying, interesting debate.
Nicely put.
Can
Precisely,
I-
Ambassador. I wanted to give you and both
Okay.
you and Boris Nemtsov a chance to quickly come back on what we just heard.
Sure, I wanted to address a couple of points that both Boris and Jim had made. And first off, there are a couple traps that I think it's important that Europe not fall into. One of them is not telling the truth. It's very important that we're able to say what is actually happening and then take the consequences of our own decisions based on that. And one of the things that I'm afraid that we will see a slippage in assessing Russia's withdrawal from Georgia, because we had the August 12th agreement. It was clear enough with the follow-up letters from President Sarkozy. We had a September 8th agreement, which was a way towards implementation of that. And we have Russia that's now not even implementing the September 8th one. And to say that, well, this is still good enough, I think we have to be very careful about that. Another trap not to fall into is to think that because we will criticize Russian policies or say things like they have not implemented their agreements on withdrawing from Georgia, that is somehow launching into a confrontation with Russia, and our only option is to go forward with the business as usual that we had been doing, whether it's the NATO-Russia Council or whether it's the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement or the summit with Russia to be held on November 13th in Nice. Those aren't the only options. We can have an ability to criticize or address issues that we're concerned about and to communicate with Russia at the same time and not to be trapped into everything or nothing. In fact, it's kind of an old Cold War reflex from Europe. It's kind of surprising to see that criticizing policies that are contrary to our values is somehow too concerning for us to be able to do because of the consequences of doing so. I think we have to get out of that and address the issues on their merits. The other point I just want to underscore, because Jim said that MAP can be a distraction, and I think that's my point as well. I think it has become a distraction because it is only a tool to help countries implement the kinds of reforms to get to the stage that Jim said, where their membership in NATO would be a strengthening of their own societies and a strengthening of NATO at the same time. And we have to put in the investment and the work to do that. That's why we created the MAP, to have a tool for doing that. It has now become politicized in a way that it's being difficult to use that tool. But we should keep the objective the same to try to advance that.
I hear the ceilings of possibly a MAP alternative, perhaps in works, but maybe that's something we can get to further in the discussion. Mr. Nemtsov, I wanted to give you a chance before we go back to the audience to come back on some of the points we heard on Russia. We heard Russia's mindset being described as a combination of injured pride and almost a drunk victory, sense of drunk victory. With that, does it capture the Russia as you know it?
I agree, that's true. What is the main general public feeling in Russia? That, yes, Russia failed in the Cold War. Russia was weak during the last decade of the 20th century. The US and the West occupied Russian borders and tried to control everything around. Now we became stronger and stronger, and nostalgia about empire is a real feeling. And this feeling existed, I explained why, and this feeling is under very strong supportive from Putin propaganda every day. There are special guys, so-called guys, like Pavlovsky, like Leontiev, like Markov, whatever. A lot of guys, who are not, of course, who are very wealthy guys, and they explain people why we face a lot of problems, why we have poverty, why we have tensions with everybody, etc. Well, what I can say about that? Of course, an idea of empire is a very historical idea for Russia. Problem is that empire is very expensive. Maybe empire is very lucky for Russian soul, but it's too expensive. You have to pay for army, for secret services, for Navy and Air Force bases around the world, etc. And the Russian economy is very weak. If you look at the GDP world, it's less than 3% of GDP. That's why to be an empire, we have no economic chance. I believe that such kind of policy is anti-Russian policy, is against Russian interests, because if you have a choice between pensions and military, and finally you decide to pay for militaries, what does it mean for 38 million of Russian pensioners? This is anti-Russian policy. And the most important goal for opposition is to explain Russian people. Of course, we have no chance to explain. What is funny that it's forbidden to discuss about crisis on TV. Do you know?
Yeah.
There is no such kind of topic in Russia at all.
Absolutely.
Just government decision, president decision, whatever. But if you want to discuss what's happened with Russian ruble, with Russian central reserves, with Russian Gazprom debt is about $60 billion, don't forget about that. Well, this is completely forbidden. That's why, of course, for us, for opposition, it's very difficult to operate in censorship situation. But we have no choice. That's why to explain that this is maybe very good, but this is impossible because we have no chance, and we prefer people to be healthy and wealthy than to be with weapons and nuclear weapons. I think that such kind of policy will be very understandable. People don't want to hear about democracy. I check it 100 times. You know, if you talk just about freedom, about competition, about democracy, about elections even, for example, if you ask them, do you remember that Mr. Medvedev was not elected, but he was selected? People respond, yes, we know. And what else? They have no ideas about that. They don't understand the connection between, you know, fundamental points, principles, liberalism, etc., and their pockets. It's difficult to explain that there is absolutely direct connection between these two issues, right? That's why we have to talk with people in understandable point. But I believe that step by step, because of crisis, because of problems, because of oil, even in Kremlin, they will understand that such kind of aggressive policy will lead to reduction of their popularity by explaining why. Because if you lose your jobs, right, and millions of people have no chance to survive, do you think that they will watch TV once again and say that Putin is great and Medvedev is great too? I don't think so. Because, frankly, their popularity based on very understandable contract. I will pay you money and you forget about your rights. This is a contract. Why people don't have an idea about democracy? Because this is a contract. Putin increased me salaries 10% per year, every year for 8 years, right? And Putin asked me, forget about elections, forget about freedom of speech, forget about political competition, forget about opposition. And I'm ready to forget, because he increased me salary and pensions. Even my mother voted for Medvedev. You know, I explained my mother, I don't know, 100 times, like, why? Can you explain? She's very smart, very clever. That's why I'm here, right? I ask, why did you vote for this guy? Let you explain me. Boris, he increased me pensions $5. Yes, $5, that's not enough. I pay about $75 for my apartment in Nizhny Novgorod, but he increased me $5. He's thinking about me. You know, at such kind of contract is very important. But contract now will be over. And next point concerning unity of the country and the Caucasus problem. I don't mention that, but I think that this is very serious. There is another invisible contract between Putin. I especially mention Putin, not because I don't know who is Putin and who is Medvedev, but because nothing happened in changing, right? There is invisible contract between Putin and, for example, Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya. You give me money, I give you loyalty. If you don't give me money, I don't give you loyalty. And after recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, right, immediately problem of the united Russia will face, immediately. Not in 1 year, but in few years, when contract will be over between separatists like Kadyrov and Putin, they will ask, what is the difference between Chechens and between Abkhazian people and Ossetia? You recognize their independence, we want to do the same. And I think that such kind of policy, once again, Putin is based on huge amount of money. Money give him unlimited power, unlimited cynical decisions, but on the other way, sometimes money will be over. And now we are under such kind of track.
The last word in this round, James.
Very
Sher.
briefly, I just want to connect 2 dots. All of the problems that Russia really has that Boris discussed, and this whole question of democratization, because the leadership doesn't see all of this in this way. There is no feedback mechanism there, because there's no democracy in the administrative culture. And what happens is that these people just breathe one another's oxygen until there's no oxygen left in the room. And this is what you feel in Russia when you're there. Everything is turned upside down, and you don't know when you hear something upside down whether people want you to believe it or whether they believe it themselves, and it's usually a mixture of the two. And the problem with this is that you can build up a syndrome where you get actions based on what Russians call головокружение от успеха, this dizziness from success. So there is, one should not have too much confidence in the rationality of everything that is taking place at the moment.
On that somewhat depressing note, let me turn it over to the audience. I know many of you, but not all of you, so may I please ask everyone to stand up, wait for the microphone, introduce themselves, and above all, keep their remarks brief so we will give a chance to as many people as possible to ask questions. The first question I see is the end of the first row here.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrei Larionov. My question is to Minister Rikstynch. Frankly speaking, I was a little bit intrigued, maybe even puzzled by the principle that you have mentioned in your early speeches. Actually, it's a very widely shared principle for Europe to speak in one voice with Russia. My question is, to what extent this desire to speak with one voice can be some kind of balanced with the content of this voice, and about this process of forming this one voice. It's not a very big secret that this one voice can be formed not only by small nations, but some other bigger nations whose voices are heard much louder and better than some other voices. And we have heard some of these voices, like Mr. Schroeder has said that the Russian leader is the best Democrat that he has known, or Mr. Berlusconi, he is the best liberal, and Mrs. Merkel has said there is no membership for Georgia in NATO, and now we're hearing these voices that the Sarkozy plan is fulfilled. So that just the question is about the practical applicability of this wonderful principle in practical realities of our nowadays. Don't you worry that someone of sticking to these particular principles, you're risking, actually, you're sacrificing your own voices in favor of some other voices that will be better heard and actually have, frankly speaking, much higher chance to become introduced as the one voice policy of the European Union?
Thank you. Allow me to take 2 more questions. I'll take them in rounds of 3 if the panelists agree. I saw a question right behind you, second row.
Hello, Ermete Mariani from Italy. A question to Mr. Nemtsov. You said that Mr. Putin hasn't got a lot of friends now. He's trying to reinforce his relation in Middle East, especially with some countries like Algeria, Syria, or some other actors like in Iraq and Palestine.
Could I ask you to pass the microphone to the middle of the front row?
Explain why Russia's trying to reinforce its position in the Middle East.
Yes, Niels Mojsnieks, University of Latvia. I have a question for Mr. Nemtsov and Mr. Scher. We talked about Russia blaming the West, or about the irrationality frequently that you hear in discussions within Russia. But certainly, the Russian leadership must be drawing some policy conclusions from the global financial crisis, from the capital flight, from the stock market crisis. Can you elaborate a bit on, do you see them, what kind of conclusions are they drawing? What can we expect in terms of exposure to the outside world and relations with international financial institutions and so on? Surely it can't be solely irrational.
Thank you. Panelists, who would like to go first?
Well, maybe I will take the question from Mr. Larionov on one voice. Indeed, this is the biggest challenge, perhaps, when it comes to the common foreign policy of European Union, to reach a consensus, because this is an area where the consensus is needed, and this is an area where perhaps the smaller nations have more possibilities to exercise their influence over the decisions taken by whole organization. You were referring to a number of politicians. Yes, indeed, they have expressed their views. I would consider them within the framework of democratic debate. But if we look at the formal decisions adopted at the level of European Council or at the level of foreign ministers of European Union, then there, the each and single voice of every EU member state is important in order to get and reach a consensus. And therefore, we from our side, we are very much interested to move forward with a deeper integration of the European Union in the foreign and security policy. This is why we have supported here in Latvia at the level of our parliament the Lisbon Treaty. Unfortunately, recently, or this summer, it was rejected by one of the member states. I do hope that they will find a solution, because the Lisbon Treaty provided new possibilities for more coherent foreign policy of the European Union. I wouldn't describe this whole debate in a very, gray colors that you refer to some of the politicians, that might create a certain risk for coherent European foreign policy. As I said, I do believe that we have to listen to those views, but in order to have decisions regarding concrete policies, consensus is needed, and our voice is there, Estonian voice is there, Lithuanian voice is there, Polish voice, whatever voice is needed.
Me?
Mr. Nemtsov.
Well, question concerning Middle East Russian policy. First of all, main priority for Medvedev and Putin in the foreign policy is neighbors. Neighbors. That's why they pay very careful attention what's happened everywhere, including on this conference. Tonight I will be in Moscow. You don't, I will be.
Yes.
Well, and neighbors, what they want to increase their influence in the former Soviet area, right? It's the first point. Middle East, I think that behavior of these gentlemen will base on the very primitive and wrong principle. What is bad for America is good for Russia. That's it. Because they proceed anti-American policy everywhere. And that's very stupid, but this is reality. For example, when it was a conflict even in North Korea, which is a huge danger for Russian area, because they tested one time missiles, and one missiles fall down very close to Vladivostok, you know? Not to San Francisco and Los Angeles, Vladivostok, because this is very close. Well, even in this case, they thought what will be good, to be quiet or to support the US. Finally, they decided to support, fortunately. In Ahmadinejad case, for example, Syria case, etc., always they think Is it good for America or not? That's very serious. I think that the biggest mistake of this gentleman is they have already made wrong choice, wrong enemy. And this is disaster for Russia, and this is a problem for the world. But they made. Israel, this is a good question. They have not bad relationship with Israel. I explain you why. Because there is like a contract, you know? If you will be quiet concerning Russian-Georgian war, we will solve your problem with Russian weapons to Syria. For example. This is like business, or fraud business, or tricky business, whatever. If you want us to be loyal to you, do what we want in our area, post-Soviet area. That's why if you want to predict what will be their behavior in Iraq, everywhere, think what is good for America and make decision. Crisis, great question. Yeah. This is mad story. Mad story. They believe that after crisis, ruble, maybe yuan, will be an international currency, and dollar and European currency will be like nowadays Russian and yuan. They always mention an idea, this is not a joke, this is what's happened. They always mention that Moscow has to be financial capital of the world and financial center of the world. In the middle of September, Putin made a statement and speech. September 16, he said that crisis is over. Do you know that? He said this sentence in the middle of September. I explain you why. Because they use state money to support financial market, capital market. Market increased 20%. It's easy. Well, next day market fall 50%, but nobody noticed about that. But this day, and he said that crisis is over. Problem is that this gentleman was very popular, very powerful, very serious guy when economy was on the right track and when Russia collected a lot of money and a lot of financial strength. And he is unprofessional when we are talking about crisis. That's why they're very afraid that they will face a lot of social problems, a lot of tensions, a lot of poor people on the street, a lot of gastarbeiter problems, and with immigrants, etc., they have a lot of problems. And I don't think that they estimate adequate what's happened, really. I don't think so. There is no discussion. For example, Andrei Larionov, former advisor to Mr. Putin, you know, it's forbidden for him to be on Russian TV. 100% forbidden. He's on the blacklist, like me. That's why there is no public discussion about crisis at all. That's why this stupid idea about we are the world center of currency and the financial market, this kind of ideas is in life. And I'm afraid that such kind of development will be continued unless we will get less than $100 billion in the central bank reserves. After that, when Russia will face devaluation problem, maybe they will think that we have to start some discussion to attract some clever guys and to do something. You know, reforms begin when money is over. If you have unlimited amount of money, why should you think about something? You know, if you have unlimited amount of money, you can be stupid or idiot. It doesn't matter. You have to think just when you are poor.
James.
I'm allowed on Russian TV, but without sound. My lips move, but you don't. But very quickly.
But sometimes if you look at the face of Ivanov, for example, it's enough.
I know the question wasn't put to me, but on the Middle East, there are three motivations. First, as Boris said, to irritate the enemy. But secondly, the energy issues, you know, Russia's aim is to be part of every distribution system in the world, to be able to introduce blocking mechanism. But its relationship with Iran has to be put in a totally separate category. Russia has built up very important economic and geopolitical interests in Iran, and its overwhelming priority is to maintain these interests irrespective of whether Iran has nuclear weapons or not. The fact that Russia doesn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons doesn't mean they will adopt our policy or sacrifice these aims and sacrifice these profits and benefits. If Iran is to be a nuclear state, Russia is determined to be Iran's friend. I think part of what explains what Boris is talking about, this lack of comprehension on the part of Putin especially about the financial crisis, is this. There are, roughly speaking, two broad blocks of investment interests in Russia. There is that whole scheme of interests who depend upon further globalization and involvement with the world economy. There is another block of interests, sometimes called its national capital. People like Ņemcov, who run Rostechnologia, who build on the defense complex, build on the high-tech sector, and much of the energy sector, who believe whether we adopt Western standards or not, the West will have to deal with our energy sector on our terms. We don't need to integrate in any meaningful way. And these people behind Putin are telling him that Russia is in a strong position when we can see that Russia is really not in a strong financial position.
Thank you. Let me turn back to the audience. I think I'd be ideally try to get in two more rounds of questions. So let us take 3 more, but quick ones so that we can make room for another round as well. The first question I had was, okay, let's reverse the order. Right there. Thank you.
Vladimir Sokor, Jamestown Foundation. One of the panelists, James Sher, thankfully began answering questions that I asked in a comprehensive way during the previous panel, to no edifying answer. And that is the question of security in the Black Sea, which in my view is the chief security vulnerability for Europe and the Euro-Atlantic community today. The events in Georgia exposed a vacuum of usable power, of security, and a vacuum of international authority in the entire Black Sea region. My question to panelists is, what are their recommendations to NATO, to the European Union, and to the United States in a national capacity to remedy that power vacuum in this key region? And my next question is related to the first one. The proverbial elephant in the room, energy security. What are the panel's views of how the issue of energy security and unnecessarily growing dependence on Russia impacts on hard security issues of the Euro-Atlantic community, including the availability and use of conventional power, as well as on soft security issues, such as the penetration and corruption of Western political and financial systems on the back of Russian energy supplies and on the back of over-dependence on those supplies. What are the panel's thoughts on this?
Thank you. I have 2 more questions in this round. The gentleman right next to me.
May I make not a question, but some remarks? Yes, some remarks on the issue Russia's and Georgia's war, Russia's and Georgia's conflict. What is the main point of this war? What's the main aim? What should we have to achieve? To my understanding is maybe it should be the settlement of the conflict. I am afraid that not a settlement. Exists more important issue. It's not to repeat such kind of conflict, not repetition of this kind of conflict somewhere else around the Russia. My colleague Bernard Kouchner, French foreign minister, said that he is not sure that the current conflict in South Ossetia and Abkhazia will not happen again somewhere else. And Mr. Kushner mentions Crimea. I would like to pay your attention to other sensitive regions. And are we sure about that such conflicts will not be repeated somewhere? I'm not sure about that. And from one side, from the one hand, we have not to isolate Russia, and from the other hand is not to encourage Russia to repeat such exercise. So, do we have the agenda for such scenario? To my understanding, yes. It is too early to resume the talks on post-PCA, but we have to achieve positive results in some very important areas. For example, fulfillment of Russia's legal obligations on withdrawal troops to the position held prior to 7th of August. Second important issue I would propose to achieve the result would be substantial and constructive role of the Geneva Conference. Third issue would be admittance of OSCE, United Nations, and EU observers to the problematic regions, and admittance of humanitarian aid. It's too
I
much.
ask you to wrap it up.
Yes, and so on and so on. And as Director Lasek said, systematical and structural enforcement of Russia's neighbors in political, economical, and defense sense also is important. So we have what to do in settling this conflict. Thank you.
I don't believe you introduced yourself. Would you mind telling us?
Yes, Petras Vaitiekūnas, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
Thank you very much. And I had a question from a lady in the first row.
Ines Vaider, a member of European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee. So my questions mainly go to Mr. Nemtsov, but also the first question will be to all panelists. So Mr. Nemtsov said that the empire is very expensive. You said we have to pay, or you have to pay for army, secret services, and etc. And I'm thinking about another kind of payments, and I will speak openly, although it's a very slippery theme. It's about probably payments to European politicians. Yes. Because sometimes suddenly some politicians start to promote the 100% energy dependence on Russia, on gas supply. It's strange, of course. Some politicians in European Parliament suddenly don't see what's happening in Georgia. So this could be the first question. What do you think about this? And the second question is about NGOs in Russia, because you also said the only way how to make good relationship to Russia is democratization of Russia. And I see that NGOs could be one of these pillars to this road. But being in the delegation EU-Russia in the March in spring this year in Moscow, I just saw that the NGOs are now somehow hopeless and helpless because nobody wants to donate to this. The entrepreneurs are afraid to donate to them. So, and I really see this kind of democratization as very complicated ones. What do you think about this? Thank you.
Thank you. Full agenda, energy security, soft corruption, NGOs, democratization, and a warning from the Foreign Minister of Lithuania. Perhaps we should be looking at preventing future conflicts rather than trying to restore status quo ante in Georgia. Who would like to take that on?
Maybe if I can follow the issue raised by my colleague Petras Vaitiekūnas regarding, he mentioned also the PCA context regarding our relations with Russia. And actually the theme of this panel, the business as usual with Russia, I think in order to answer the question whether we are entering the business as usual phase, we have to give an answer to another question, whether we have seen in last years many concrete examples that our relations with Russia was business as usual, and whether Russia was seeking those relations in a business as usual terms. I would say that Russia was perhaps sometimes preoccupied with special recognition of Russia's role on the world scene, and the Western powers have accommodated those concerns in different ways, in form and also in substance. In form, we have created the special Russian-NATO Council. We have launched the PCA negotiations in the early 90s. We have admitted Russia to the Council of Europe during rather interesting times. And I remember it was one of the Chechen wars going on at that particular moment. But I would say that we have to focus more, not so much on the form of our cooperation, but on the substance. And PCA, I think importance of the PCA sometimes also is exaggerated, because we do have already a legal framework with the European Union and Russian Federation. This is the old PCA. If we can achieve something better, let's go for it. We would prefer the legally binding framework of relations between European Union and Russian Federation, because, as I mentioned during my previous interventions, we as a small state, we do support the legal norms in international relations. But the question here is about timing. Is the timing ripe for reopening of those negotiations? Do we need to rush into very quick conclusions already this November? Or do we need to have kind of package deal by, from one hand, reopening those negotiations on the new PCA, and from the other hand, having a comprehensive approach regarding the Eastern Partnership, the proposal brought forward by our Swedish and Polish friends, to have a comprehensive program of European Union, how we engage the Russian neighborhood. And then, I think in parallel, we have to look at the developments in Caucasus, how the situation is developing there. We do know that there are a number of problems also for international observers. In Georgia, we are not able to enter the separatist regions. Not only the EU observers, but also the eight huge number, 8 OSCE observers, they are unable to enter Tshinvali. I think we have to follow very closely how the negotiations in Geneva are progressing and whether there is a progress. And therefore, I would argue that we should not run into very quick decisions regarding the future steps we Europeans are going to take vis-a-vis EU-Russian relations. On energy security, I do understand that some of my colleagues are perhaps more familiar with that issue, and perhaps Boris Nemtsov has the inside look on this theme. I think there is lots of talk about this in Europe, about energy security, and perhaps the practical deeds are somewhat lagging behind. When it comes particularly to this region, the Baltic region, of course, we do consider ourselves as pretty much isolated from the rest of European energy networks. At the same time, we have to look separately at the electricity supplies and supplies in the field of gas or oil. When it comes to the electricity, then there are a number of projects underway. I'm very pleased that a couple of weeks ago we reached an agreement at the level of President of European Commission that European Commission by the end of this year will table a plan for new projects concerning new interconnections here in the Baltic region. Sometimes we, with our Lithuanian neighbors, are considered to be in certain competition. That's very good that the Commission comes in and will tell which is the best possible project. As you know, the Estonians are linked to the Finnish networks. The Lithuanians are working also on their interconnection with Poland, and the new nuclear power station in Ignalina. I think when it comes to electricity, the things might look not as dangerous as it is regarding the gas supply, where we are fully dependent on the Russian gas supplies. As I have said many times in public, so far we have not experienced any disruptions in gas supply. The question is about the price, which was going up and up, not annually, but on a monthly basis. By the way, yesterday we got the news that maybe Gazprom will reduce the price for exports for the gas in coming months. But the reason why we didn't experience any disruptions in the gas sector perhaps is linked to the very nature of cooperation in that field, because the Russian gas is pumped into the underground gas storages here in Latvia, and part of that is sent back to the Russian western regions like Pskov or even St. Petersburg. So therefore, one can say that we are in this sector kind of interdependent. But in the long run, I don't see that there are very many clear alternatives unless the consumers at the end of the day are willing to pay higher price.
James.
I think we need to abuse ourselves of the notion that we are going to overcome our differences with Russia soon. We have to learn to live with them for a prolonged period of time. Boris earlier mentioned that if you take away money, there will be economic reform. The best antidote to today's way of thinking geopolitically is failure. We need a policy which we cannot conduct on our own without real support from Russia's neighbors to persuade Russia that they cannot do this again. Now, here we come to Crimea. If you want to focus on something, what we need to focus on is the broader significance of the Black Sea Fleet issue as we get closer to the year 2017. Not on military grounds, but because the Black Sea is a profound economic power in Ukraine and an intelligence power and instrument. Russia's means of influencing Ukraine and destabilizing Ukraine are indirect and unconventional. Ukraine is not Georgia. The means of achieving the same end are different there because Ukraine is a radically different place with its divisions, multiple divisions, with the structural presence of Russia and Ukraine's economy and everywhere else. If you talk to people who understand these things in Ukraine, they will say the principal means of sharpening interfaces and destabilizing the country, the principal actors are Russian intelligence services, and their principal base is the Black Sea Fleet, and behind every action, the principal means is money. There is an unhealthy combination of partnership between the Russian state, Russian business, and Russian intelligence services operating in Ukraine. And this requires collaboration and assistance of a very different kind from a classical Cold War kind. And a lot of people in NATO have understood this. We have enough institutions to do this, but they need to be properly resourced and they have to be made to work. But that issue, Black Sea Fleet, is one we really will have to focus on.
Ambassador Volker.
I can make just a few quick comments. One of them, to pick up a point that was mentioned, and I'll address some of the questions raised in the course. The perspective of people in Russia about the 90s and the weakness of Russia, U.S. taking advantage of it and so forth. I think that it's important that we all, and again in the spirit of getting things out on the table, just break the myth of Russian victimization during this time. We took extra efforts, as the minister said, to include Russia in the G8, to include in the Council of Europe, build the NATO-Russia Council. We provided assistance to Russia. We still provide assistance to Russia in a variety of ways. But it's this myth that serves a purpose. And the purpose is the exertion of power in the neighborhood and to rally people around that vision and to rally around, as you said, to have people accept that their rights are taken away in Russia in order to support the government. So we have to go after that myth of Russian victimization. The second thing is on the energy security issue. What you worry about is that a perception of dependence and a perception of economic self-interest will influence decision-making in Europe, so that certain things aren't said, certain decisions aren't taken, certain clarity about values is gently put away because of a sense of dependency or a sense of financial interest, sense of weakness. So the answer to that, and the answer to Mr. Sokor's question on the Black Sea and on the Crimea also, is we have to spend a lot of effort strengthening our own community. That it's not just about looking and seeing what what the Russian military is doing in Georgia or what Gazprom is doing. We also need to be focusing very intently on how do we strengthen our own community, our freedom of action, our resources, our independence. Those are things that I don't think we are currently very well focused on, but we need to do in order to play a more useful role. And then a third point that I just wanted to get in, because I sense this may be the last round of questions, is just on the proposal for a pan-European security treaty or organization or something, as Medvedev has put it out there. I think it's very important to remember that we have good institutions in the EU, in NATO, in the OSCE, that work for countries that have democratic values. There's not a problem with these institutions, and we have vehicles for partnership with Russia within them. So there's nothing missing in that. The difference that I see between the proposal and the OSCE is that the OSCE is anchored on the Helsinki Accords, and this proposal isn't, which means you're looking at a pan-European security framework that already exists, but taking away the foundation of the values embodied in the Helsinki Accords. I think that's troubling. And I think the way that we should address this is to take the discussion, therefore, to Vienna, to the OSCE, and say, what could we be doing to have a dialogue that is effective about European security that's good for all of us, but keep the anchor points of the Helsinki Accords in place.
Thank you. Boris Nemtsov.
Well, concerning energy security, like former Minister of Fuel and Oil of the Russian government, well, we must talk mainly about gas. Because electricity problem, there is some market opportunity, oil market exists, fortunately, and gas. We describe very carefully what's happened with export of gas from Gazprom in this book. You can find it in my website, nemtsov.ru. But I can say just few points. First, Russia faces deficit of gas. Well, according to our estimation, in 2010, deficit of gas inside domestic market, I'm talking about domestic, it's about 60 billion cubic meters. 60 billion, it's a little bit less than Ukrainian supply every year. Ukrainian, it's about 70 billion. Well, what Putin government decided to do, two opportunities. First is to cut export or to increase prices in domestic market. He made right choice, so-called right choice. Well, he increased prices inside the country 25% per year. Decision has already made about that. Of course, this is against Russian business, Russian economy, but this is a payment for monopolization and corruption, right? What's happened, my view, what's happened in the future? First, I believe that it will be liberalization of gas market, domestic market. We have independent gas producers like Lukoil, like Rosneft, like Surgutneftegas, like Novatek, etc., which are in a very, very terrible situation because Gazprom didn't permit them to use Gazprom pipeline system. But because of corruption inside Gazprom, because of absence of opportunity to increase production inside Gazprom, there is no chance for Putin to avoid real gas crisis, not in Europe, but in Russia. That's why liberalization will happen like liberalization of the market happened in the last years of the Soviet Union, right? When there were black market, for example, and some black market of gas will appear And because of corruption, because of bribes, everybody will permit to use pipeline system, etc. That's why I believe that liberalization of gas market happened not because Medvedev is liberal, but because of absence and deficit of gas. European supply. First, two points. Gazprom is not only a new weapon, but Gazprom is a huge business. Yeah. And it explains why, for example, he never cut Baltics country. Never. For example, when it was huge conflict with Estonia, I was sure that finally he cut, but he didn't. Why? Because this is money. And some people, friends of Putin, raise a lot of money, including money from Baltics. And if you cut, what's happened with your corrupted friends? That's why if you pay huge money, and money is really very huge, $500, right, this year, average price, of course, he forget that Gazprom is political weapon. As far as Ukraine is concerned, this is a different story. Ukraine pay year by year more and more, but even now less than European price. Next year, they decided to increase prices. For my estimation, Ukraine will pay finally about $400 because there is no gas in Gazprom, and they bought gas in Turkmenia for $300. That's why the only chance for in this situation is to pay for Ukraine about $400. Well, if Ukraine will pay the same like Europeans, I believe that because of business and because of friends, they will supply that, all right? Last point, Nabucco. There are a lot of speculations about Nabucco. Frankly, problem is like with the Nord Stream. There is no gas. They just, not long ago, they founded some new fields in Turkmenia, but believe me, it takes 10 years to start operation. That's why Nabucco, the only chance, especially for Americans, the only chance to fulfill Nabucco is to use Iranian gas. Yes. I don't think that you will be very happy about that. but Iran is a real huge producer of gas, and Iran can use these new fields for Nabucco, and I believe that finally Ahmadinejad will suggest Europeans that, guys, okay, we are ready. Well, forget about the US and we will give you something. It will be competition between Putin and Ahmadinejad for European market, which is a great idea, of course, but I think that Nabucco, this is very long-term project and no illusion. Well, what else? I believe that if prices for oil and gas in a strategic point of view will be very high, finally you will think about alternative. Last point concerning Shredarization and corruption. Shredarization is a real problem for Europe. Not only for Europe, Shredarization is a problem for the United States too. Some members from so-called Valdai Club change their behavior because they're afraid not to be invited next, right? And Putin used such kind of instrument very often and very careful. That's why everything depends on you. If you are ready to protect your society from corruption, you have to do something. If you don't, such kind of policy will be implemented, not only here, but even in the United States. That's why it depends on you, and I think it will be under public discussion. I don't know what's happening. As far as I know, some top Finnish officials are involved too, and some American lobbyistic groups are involved in Gazprom assistance, etc. Well, it needs some discussion, open discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Nemtsov. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we started 10 minutes late and I was given permission to run over by 10 minutes. We used up all of the time and some, but I hope you agree it was all for a good cause. My apologies to those who did not get to ask questions. Do get them in at future panels or read Boris Nemtsov's book. And please join me in thanking our panelists for making a number of excellent points and illuminating us on the issue of Russia. Thank you.
James, thank you.